Landings are a challenging but rewarding part of your flight training. A well-executed landing demonstrates that you have the ability to perform basic maneuvers, plan approaches, and use proper landing procedures. A typical landing approach in a training aircraft begins when you enter the downwind leg at a 45-degree angle, about mid-field to the runway. Usually you're at cruise speed. By entering the pattern at mid-field, you have sufficient time to establish a track parallel to the runway and stabilize your attitude and airspeed. Once you're established on downwind and have completed your pre-landing checklist, you can use your heading indicator to help you maintain the proper distance from the runway. You can do this by visualizing the landing runway superimposed over the heading indicator. For example, if 29 is the landing runway, you can fly a parallel but opposite course by flying the reciprocal heading of 110 degrees. When at a point opposite the intended landing spot, you normally reduce power and maintain your altitude until the airspeed slows to the initial approach speed. If you intend to use flaps during the approach, lower them to the first increment when the airspeed is within the white arc. The use of flaps allows you to make a steeper approach without increasing airspeed. It also allows you to touch down at a slower speed with a corresponding shorter ground roll. Throughout the approach, use trim to relieve control wheel pressure. When the airplane slows to the approach airspeed, begin a descent. However, maintain the downwind heading until your intended point of landing is approximately 45 degrees behind the aircraft. Then initiate a medium bank turn. A glance at your heading indicator will help you determine the proper rollout point. You already know that the base leg is approximately 90 degrees from the runway. So when the visualized runway is 90 degrees off the nose of your aircraft, you are on the correct heading. During the base leg, lower the second increment of flaps if they are being used, and adjust the power as necessary to maintain the desired approach path and airspeed. Complete the turn to final so that the airplane is aligned with the runway. At this point, adjust your final approach to intercept the glide path. Lower the final increment of flaps and trim the airplane. If precise control is maintained throughout the landing, the time from power reduction to the touchdown phase will be approximately the same on each approach. During the touchdown phase, you will need to flare or rotate the airplane to the touchdown attitude. At approximately 10 to 20 feet above the runway, initiate the flare by applying gradual back pressure on the control wheel. This decreases the rate of descent and airspeed. As you begin the flare, reduce the power to idle if you haven't already done so. The airplane should reach a zero rate of descent when the main wheels are just off the runway at an airspeed just above a stall. The attitude at touchdown should be very close to the takeoff attitude. The main gear should touch down first, with the nose gear clear of the runway. After touchdown, maintain back pressure to prevent abrupt nose wheel contact with the runway. After the nose wheel has settled to the runway, gradually relax the back pressure to provide positive nose wheel steering. Throughout your training, you should try to be as consistent as possible to reduce the number of adjustments needed in the traffic pattern. However, you may have to alter the pattern for local procedures or for proper spacing behind other aircraft. If adjustments are required, you can make them in several ways. You may vary power or change the starting point of the descent. You may also extend the downwind or delay flap extension. The earlier you recognize a need for adjustment, the smaller the correction will have to be. To fly a consistent pattern, you must compensate for the effects of wind. In order to do this, you must be able to fly a straight line over the ground, regardless of the wind direction. If there is no wind, tracking a straight line is nothing more than pointing the nose of the airplane in the direction you want to fly. However, If the wind is blowing at an angle to your flight path, it will blow you off course unless you take corrective action. You will need to position the nose of the airplane into the wind just enough to stop the drift. The angle formed between your heading and the ground track is called the crab angle, or wind correction angle. How much you crab into the wind will depend on the direction and speed of the wind, as well as your direction of flight and airspeed. For example, if the wind is directly down the runway, you must crab the airplane into the wind on the base leg. If you don't apply any correction, the airplane will drift further from the runway, increasing the length of the final approach leg. Strong winds not only affect the base leg, but also have a marked effect on the final approach. When you turn into the wind on final, your ground speed is reduced. However, the rate of descent remains the same. If you make no corrections, touchdown will be short of the intended point. Therefore, use additional power and increase the pitch attitude slightly to maintain the proper glide path and approach. After the correct glide path is established, try to maintain a constant approach angle. In this way, the apparent shape of the runway will remain fixed. A shorter, wider shape indicates you're low on the approach, while a longer, narrower shape indicates you're too high. If the approach is high, the normal reaction is to lower the nose and dive the airplane at the intended point of landing. While this may increase the rate of descent slightly, the most pronounced effect is that it will build up excessive airspeed, which significantly reduces the time it takes to descend. Therefore, the airplane will still be high as it approaches the threshold. In addition, the excess speed requires time to dissipate, so the airplane may float well beyond the touchdown point. The proper corrective action is to reduce power, extend additional flaps if available, and maintain the proper approach attitude and airspeed. This should increase the rate of descent without reducing the time to the threshold. Another way to lose altitude is to use a forward slip. This is accomplished by lowering the upwind wing and applying sufficient opposite rudder pressure to displace the nose of the aircraft toward the high side of the bank. This increases drag by presenting a larger surface area to the relative wind, with a corresponding increase in the descent rate. If you use a forward slip to lose altitude, establish a normal descent before making the transition to the touchdown phase. Not every one of your landings is going to be perfect. Therefore, you need to know what to do if your approach and landing are something other than normal. For example, if the airspeed is low during the flare, you should delay the power reduction. This will help prevent a rapid loss of altitude with a high sink rate and possibly a hard landing. Conversely, if airspeed is higher than normal, maintain just enough back pressure to keep the airplane in level flight until the excessive airspeed is dissipated. Then continue the flare until the airplane touches down. Flaring too early or too late can also present a problem. If you begin the flare too soon, the airplane may stall prior to touchdown. The resulting high sink rate and hard ground contact may result in structural damage to the landing gear and its supporting structures. If you flare too early, add power and stabilize the attitude in a position from which you can make a normal landing. However, if insufficient runway remains, initiate a go-around. If your flare is started too late, you may touch down at a high rate of descent and the airplane may bounce. If the airplane bounces just a few feet in the air and you have plenty of runway left, you might consider placing the airplane back in the landing attitude, adding a little power and letting the airplane settle back onto the runway. Under many circumstances, however, it is best to initiate a go-around by applying full power and adjusting the pitch to the takeoff attitude. Then when you have enough airspeed, make a normal climb out. If the flaps are extended, slowly retract them as the airplane gains altitude and airspeed. As you gain experience, you will develop the ability to analyze and recover from an awkward situation and make a normal landing. But if you're ever in doubt about the outcome, a properly executed go-around is your best bet.